In early 1970 I started a job as an assembly fitter for English Rose Kitchens in Wharf Street, Warwick. Around the same time George Nelson Dale & Co were being listed in local directories for the very last time. 12 years on in the 1980s I reacquainted myself with Emscote Mills whilst researching history for the Saltersford Canal project. I bought a copy of Nelson's Home Comforts dated 1897 from a shop in Spencer Street, Leamington Spa for just £5. The book sat on my shelf for more than 20 years before I looked at it again. In 2008 I obtained a copy of Alfred Barnard's 1899 book Roundabout Warwick with a peep into the gelatine factory at Emscote. I decided to upload the book onto my website. My little bit for my hometown, I thought. How wrong I was. I'm not close to completing my contribution to what has been a fascinating journey. This presentation is just one aspect of that journey. Hopefully it will give you a flavour of one of Warwick's great industrial success stories and an insight into a most remarkable Warwick family, the Nelsons of Warwick. George Nelson was born in Nottingham in 1800. His father and uncle were said to have been ruined by the American wars. His father and grandfather were both sheriffs of Nottingham and were also named George. George, after studying chemistry, moved to Leamington Priors, where he partnered Godfrey and White at a chemist shop at 3 Union Parade, and was also in business with Herring at 33 Bath Street. It was in a lab in Regent's Place that Leamington salts was said to have been first manufactured by evaporation from the celebrated saline. George Nelson proclaimed that his was the only genuine manufactory of Leamington salts in the town. He later moved to Rock Mill Leamington and whilst there took out his first patent for the manufacture of gelatine in 1837, which was granted the following year. He set out to improve on the centuries-old practice for making jellies. His vision was to create a product that was colourless, odourless as well as consistent in how it set, one that didn't leave an aftertaste associated with products of that time. He was said to be the inventor of the world's first table jelly. Sale of his gelatine product increased rapidly and the firm moved to Emscote Mills in 1841. Lime was an important chemical and was in plentiful supply, along with water extracted from 2 wells on the site. By 1844, gelatine was being exported to America. George Nelson died in 1850. He is buried in the churchyard at Old Milverton, overlooking Guy's Cliff House and the Saxon Mill. He had 5 sons who survived him. His gelatine business was well established, but his sons were still young and not able to take an active part in the business at that stage. Thomas Bellamy Dale was the cousin and partner of George Nelson. He managed the London business until the death of George in 1850, when he moved to Warwick to head the firm there. He, like George, studied as a chemist and was involved in the business from its beginnings. He also took an active part in local affairs and was elected Mayor of Warwick on 3 occasions. He was involved in the sanitary improvements of the borough, as well as the adoption of the Free Library Act. Around 1880 he built the Temperance Hotel and Coffee House at the Old Square, Warwick. Thomas Dale provided a teetotal establishment with entertainment at the hotel to encourage men away from the numerous public houses. They were universally held responsible for drunkenness and poor health amongst the working classes. Thomas Dale is believed to have purchased Christ Church, a church that once stood at the top of the parade in Leamington Spa. It was demolished in the 1970s. He lived at Clevedon Villa, one of the blue brick houses in Coton End. Emscote Mills are situated in Wharf Street on the Grand Union Canal, formerly the Warwick and Knapton Canal. The mills at one time spread over a 5-acre site. The main entrance to Emscote Mills was to the left of the offices and had a weighbridge built into the roadway. The entrance was one of 5 on the site. Water was drawn from the sandstone and delivered to an elevated tank. Machinery was an important factor and extensively used, with huge copper, iron and Daltonware vessels. Trucks and water barrows transferred raw materials from one stage of the treatment to another. Hides were brought by canal to the doors of the receiving houses. Nelsons were self-sufficient with support trades on site, among them engineers, fitters, cabinet makers, joiners, painters, as well as plumbers, blacksmiths and builders. There were sawmills and a variety of workshops, as well as a packing case manufactory. In 1899 there were 38 steam engines on the premises, varying in size from 1 to 30 horsepower. 4 of these were powerful pumping engines for pumping the wells, 3 for pumping water into the steam boilers, 2 for working the filter presses, 3 for supplying power to the lifts, the remainder for driving the endless belts and various machinery throughout the factory. The freezing house contained a refrigerating engine of 30 horsepower. The boiler house contained 4 Galloway boilers, each 30 feet long. The word gelatine is derived from the Latin gelo, meaning I freeze. Gelatine softens and swells in cold water, but does not dissolve until it is heated. When the solution cools, it solidifies to a firm jelly. Sources of gelatines are hides, calf's feet and various tissues of animal. Hides were used at Emscote. First the hides were soaked cleaned over many weeks, then boiled, strained, skimmed and allowed to gelatinize. The hot jelly was taken from evaporating vessels, poured on massive plate glass slabs, when set, placed on nets and stretched on frames, then taken to a drying room to harden before being ready for cutting and packing. Gelatine was largely consumed as a food, blancmange, creams and table jellies, as well as in consolidated extract of meat, soups and in many preparations of confectionery. Opaque gelatine was finely shredded. Brilliant gelatine was made from thinner sheets and cut into very fine shreds. This was mostly exported around the world in large quantities, mainly in bulk. Amber gelatine was manufactured for home consumption, in flake or leaf, as well as in tablet and granulated jellies. Patent refined isinglass was very finely shredded. This was a cheaper alternative to Russian isinglass. Charles Nelson was 17 years old when his father died. He was the elder of the 5 brothers. He assisted in the business of the lime and cement works at Stockton, manufacturing Portland cement and Blue Lias lime. The gelatine business remained with Thomas Dale, a 1/3 partner with Sarah Nelson, widow of George. In 1868, there were 70 plus employed at the works. 2 years later, Charles had entered into partnership with Thomas Blythe and William Blackstone. He was considered a very good engineer, even to the extent of drawing up some of the plans for the buildings. In 1909, Nelsons practically owned the village of Stockton, the population of which was composed almost entirely of workmen employed at the works. This included 90 cottages, a village hall, a club room, cooperative stores, and later the Nelson Club in 1914. Baths could be had at the club for 2pence, but only if at least 3 members wanted one at the same night. In 1916, women were allowed to have baths also. They were working the quarries after all, while the men were out fighting for their country. The supply of Bovril had stopped towards the end of the First World War, and so it was agreed at a special meeting of the committee to sell Oxo instead. Initially, horse-drawn boats were used to transport coal, lime and cement. These were replaced by some of the very first steam-powered narrowboats on the canals. Charles Nelson had 3, Jason, Janus and Jupiter. For rail, shy horses were used to move and shunt wagons, managed by a man called a wagoner. The horses were worked 2 at a time, one behind the other, pulling loaded cement trucks. There were 3 narrow gauge locos at Stockton, built by Peckett, Gamecock, Nairas and Jurassic, built in 1897, all scrapped by 1949. Charles Nelson resided at Crackley Hall in Kenilworth, where he died aged 45 of Bright's disease. George Nelson devoted his life exclusively to the gelatine business at Emscote, which he entered into in 1851 under the guidance of Thomas Dale. He was 14 years old. George became a partner in the firm 9 years later. He was said to have been skillful in management as well as being knowledgeable and expert in every aspect of the process of the business. He was at the heart of the operation at Warwick. Considering his contribution and importance to the gelatine manufactory, as well as his 40 years plus service, little is known about him. For the most part he lived at the Lawn at Emscote, later retiring to Rousham near Oxford. The Lawn at Emscote was home to the Nelson family, being in residence there from 1844 until the early 1920s. Originally leasing the property, they bought it outright in around 1880. This was at one of the most profitable periods in the Nelson business history. The lawn was remodelled and extended in the latter part of the 19th century, mainly by George Henry. The central portion was the original 5-bay house circa 1844, the west wing being the first addition built around 1872, followed by the east wing in 1888. Both wings, as well as the lodge built around 1869, are early examples of construction with concrete blocks. The interior was also redesigned, retaining the cantilevered staircase with cast iron balustrade. Later it became Emscote Lawn School. The school was run by headmaster Jonathan Riley and his brother Christopher. The lawn was listed in July 1999. It is notable for its many trees, a theme that was a constant with Nelson properties throughout the world. Common limes still line the former drive, with giant redwoods, an oak, cedar, as well as a dead weeping ash. Nelson Village was a model colony containing workmen's cottages and villas for the works managers, as well as a water tower which supplied the village and clubhouse with constant supply. The village forms part of Charles Street and now is all but lost in the expanse of Percy Estate. At one time they were the only buildings on the north side of the canal in that particular area. Built around 1889, they stand as a testament to the vision of the Nelson family, who it seemed fully understood the relationship that should exist between capital and labour. Many employees attained over 25 years service, with some reaching 50 years. One particular family, the Wrights, spanned at least 3 generations. In Charles Street, originally part of Wharf Street, stands the Nelson Workingmen's Club, opened in 1883 and built in 1882. This was an enormous event for the town. The Warwick Advertiser and Leamington Courier newspapers devoted a full-page spread to the event. The accommodation provided at Nelson Club included a public bar, a smoking and games room, a library and a reading room. According to the rule book, if a member had been reading a newspaper for more than 10 minutes and another member requested it, the paper had to be immediately handed over. On the first floor of the building there were 3 spacious billiard rooms containing 4 tables by Burroughs and Watts. It had a theatre 90 feet in length, which was used as a dining hall during the day. The club had a fully equipped stage with scenery and a drop curtain painted by a London artist, as well as a piano by Collard and Collard. The club is still in use today. Nelson's involvement in photography was already established at the time of the visit of the British Journal of Photography to Emscote in 1880. Gelatine was previously known to photographers as one of the substances used to mount prints. It became of greater importance as one of the chief sensitive agents in the carbon or pigment printing process. It promised to replace collodion as the medium for forming the sensitive layer on glass used in cameras. In 1896, the Warwick Dry Plate Company was formed to discover the right types of gelatine to improve photographic processing. Austin Edwards came to Emscote Mills to help with that foundation. He later manufactured film at Emscote Mills on his own account. The knowledge gained by this enterprise played its part in the growth of the photographic industry, which had expanded rapidly with roll films, cinematographic X-rays and new colour film processes. In the 1950s, Nelson had research labs and an emulsion making plant where gelatine formulas were developed and tested for slow and fast film speed processing. Nelson's photographic gelatine was used by all of the world's chief photographic manufacturers. Nelson's advertised their products in many ways, one of the most popular being Nelson's Home Comforts, a hardback cookery book that was available for the cost of a stamp. Over 1 million were distributed between 1880 and 1910. George Nelson was quick to realise the importance of local landmarks and utilised Kenilworth Castle in his early advertising as a chemist back in 1830. That theme, along with scenes of Warwick Castle, Stratford upon Avon and the Lord Leicester Hospital, were adopted for many years to promote the sale of Nelson lozenges. Lozenges came in many forms, milk and chocolate, and even mutton, none of which caught on. Licorice and fruit essence were very popular though. Nelson's fruitlets were sold in penny machines throughout the country. Nelson's promoted their products through cookery books, pamphlets and magazines. Broadsheets were used in the early days when based at Rock Mill Leamington. Manning, in Glimpses of a Local Past, recalled having printed the very first circular by which gelatine was made known to mankind, as well as the first label that was gummed at the end of the first packet on the market. The works at Emscote kept one press at the printing office in Leamington working full-time from one year to the next. He went on to say that no signature was better known to humanity than that of George Nelson. In 1882, Mary Hooper was invited by Nelson's to revise their popular cookery book, Nelson's Home Comforts. It is more than likely that Mary Hooper was sponsored by Nelson's prior to this engagement, as all but one of her cookery books promoted Nelson's gelatine exclusively. Mary Hooper's father, a carver and gilder, was plying his trade in Bath Street, Leamington Priors. At the same time, George Nelson was involved with his chemist shops. That was probably where her association with the Nelsons began. Mary was born at 47 Bath Street in 1829 and at one time lived at the cottage that backed onto Aylesford Well in Church Walk. She later lived above her father's shop at 14 Upper Parade. The family relocated to London after 1851. Mary began her literary career as a sub-editor on the Household Words, a weekly mid-19th century magazine edited by Charles Dickens, produced in the 1850s. In the early 1870s she began publishing her own cookery books, including Handbook for the Breakfast Table and Little Dinners, which ran into 25 editions. In 1873 she was invited to form cookery courses for ladies at the Crystal Palace School of Arts, Science and Literature. She went on to become a professor of domestic economy. Mary Hooper was also involved in the beginnings of the National School of Cookery, as well as schools around the country, including at Leamington Spa. Mary was an author of novels as well as children's books, around 12 in total, though most were related to cookery. Edward Montague Nelson was involved in the commercial aspects of the business. He was based originally in London. His business acumen was undeniable. He was a deal maker and had many of his father's traits. He was chairman and managing director of the Australian Chilling and Freezing Company, the Colonial Consignment and Distributing Company, Nelson Brothers Limited, and the Central Queensland Moat Export Company. Chairman of George Nelson Dale & Co. and a director of the Australian Estates and Mortgages Company. Her Majesty the Queen Victoria, in a Diamond Jubilee year, conferred upon him the Most Distinguished Order of Knight Commander of St. Michael and St. George for services rendered in connection with the Australasian colonies and for recognition of his public services. He had performed work of national importance in securing an enormous supply of cheap food for the people of this country. He was the Charter Mayor of Ealing, a Sheriff of Middlesex, as well as a Mayor of Warwick. Previously living at Hanger Hill House, Ealing, where he is celebrated there for his many achievements to that borough. When his home at 2 Jewellery Street was put on the market, he generously allowed its use for the Warwick pageant in 1905 and 1906. William Nelson grew up in Warwick, the youngest son of George and Sarah Nelson. He was just 7 years old when his father died. He was educated at Warwick College, which later became Warwick School. On leaving, he worked at the tannery, cement works and Emscote Mills. William's diary entry of 1860, where he was greasing, hanging up kips, stuffing and scouring horse hides, slicking off and bruising legs. 19th of March, transferred to Stockton Cement. The whole of July read, gearing, grinding lime day after day, grinding cement. William's introduction to work was far from being easy, but it proved to be a good grounding for what was to come. He was a practical and hands-on man, influenced by growing up with his older brother Charles, an engineer who he referred to as Dad. His diary gives a fascinating insight into his time at Warwick and New Zealand. In 1862, William and his brother Frederick left for New Zealand on the Devonshire. After spending 6 months tramping around the country and joining the militia, they settled and worked on a sheep run. The following year they purchased the property and set about breaking it in for themselves. Low wool prices and a plague of grasshoppers made it impossible for the brothers. In 1866, William returned to England where he got married, stayed for a brief period before returning to New Zealand with his bride. He tried milling flax from the property he bought, but once more falling prices defeated him. William was forced again to return to England in 1872 with his family, where he joined his brothers George and Montague at Emscote, before making a final move back to New Zealand in 1879 on the Sarota. During those years at Warwick, William learnt about meat preservation and industrial management, and sought solutions for the problems of combating low wool prices and disposing of surplus stock. After William's return to New Zealand, he established a tallowed and canned meat factory at Tamona, Hawke's Bay, with his brother Frederick. It was designed for conversion to refrigeration, but William bided his time and let others experiment with the new process first, learning from his previous failures, no doubt. After a disastrous flood in 1897, he developed his own plans for straightening and totally diverting two main rivers. He was also responsible for the reclamation of land from Napier swamps. William Nelson is better known in New Zealand as the father of Hawke's Bay, and is commemorated with parks being named after him in both Napier and Hastings, where a bronze statue of himself and his dog stand. Nelson's played a significant part in the history of the frozen meat trade. Tamona, where they set up their works, was named after the native Maori chief Inari Tamona. William Nelson managed the New Zealand operation, where freezing works and a village for the workers were established on the same principles as in Warwick and Stockton. After the first cargo of frozen meat was successfully shipped to London in 1882, the Nelson brothers and William moved swiftly to establish a new industry in Hawke's Bay. In May 1883, the prospectus of Nelson Brothers Limited was issued by Edward Montague Nelson. Over the next decade, Nelson Brothers won the largest stake in New Zealand's frozen meat trade. For the first 2 years, the cargoes were almost entirely sold at Smithfield Market. In 1885, stores under Cannon Hill Station were opened by the brothers. Steam was supplied by 6 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, producing 800 horsepower. 2 Haslam cold air refrigerators, each capable of delivering 170,000 feet of cold air per hour, were used. And later, Nelson's expanded, opening more sites in New Zealand. The firm opened additional premises in Lambeth in 1892, which at the time was said to be the biggest and best equipped cold store warehouse in the world. Nelson's had their own wharf on the River Thames, with warehouses, cold stores and distribution station. The brothers purchased the Prince of Wales, a hulk ship, and fitted her out with refrigeration and used her at Plymouth as a distribution station for the west of England. It was eventually taken out to New Zealand in 1889 and utilised by William for temporary storage. In 1 year alone they handled in excess of 1 million carcasses and 50,000 quarters of beef. Sir Montague Nelson became the first president of the Frozen Meat Trade Association. Guy Nelson became the managing director in 1924, following his father Edward Wallace into the firm. He was involved up until his death in 1969. He was given the honorary freedom of the borough of Warwick in recognition for his 40 years eminent service. This honour was given to just 7 others, among them Field Marshal Montgomery and the Prime Minister Anthony Eden. He received an OBE for public services, was the Deputy Lieutenant of the County of Warwick, twice Mayor in 1936 and 1939, served on Warwickshire Police Authority and County Council, was appointed Justice of the Peace, and was the Warwick Racecourse Chairman from its formation. He became an alderman in 1942. Alderman Guy Nelson, OBE, DL, JP, had an active involvement in many charities. The main hall of Warwick School, the Guy Nelson Hall, was built following an appeal between 1969 and 1970. Alderman Guy Nelson, after whom the hall was named, was a long-serving chairman of governors from 1938 to 1963. As a young man he excelled in many sports, playing cricket for Leamington as well as Warwickshire. Arthur Batty was a works buyer with the company in the late 1940s. He approached Guy Nelson for some space to start up a gym. Guy Nelson obliged by finding an area in the export packing case manufactory, which he had kitted out with showers. Arthur set up a ring as well as an area devoted to weightlifting. His bespoke weights were whatever he could beg, borrow or steal from the factory. Soon after, the Turpin brothers started to train at the gym. Alderman Nelson's son, Edward Montague Nelson, Sam, was the 5th generation and the last to enter the firm in the early 1950s. In 1940, Sam with his parents and 2 sisters moved to a flat converted from the works laboratories on the upper floors of the main George Nelson and Dale office block on Wharf Street. It had 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a dining room, 2 sitting rooms, a billiard room with full-size table, kitchen, scullery, larder and servants' accommodation, as well as a half-acre walled garden. The factory, therefore, was his playground, so he knew the overall area in great detail. Sam went to boarding school from the age of 7, growing up in the belief that he would follow in his father's footsteps. He left school in 1952. He spent time in East Africa, serving in the Kenyan police force. He started work at George Nelson Dale & Co. in 1953, spending time in all departments under the guidance of the chief chemist, Dr. Richard Coleman. In February 1955 he sailed for Cape Town to work at the Davis Gelatine plant near Johannesburg. In July 1955 he sailed on to Sydney, Australia to work at the Davis plant in Botany Bay. In late 1957 Davis Gelatine took a 51% controlling share in George Nelson Dale & Co. And as part of that ratification, Sam set off once again to Sydney to continue his career. He returned to England in July 1968 when his father was ill. I'm indebted to Sam for his generosity in sharing his history and for the enormous contribution he's made in helping me bring to you just a taste of his family and their legacy to our town.